Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 469. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. I know Connor Freeman usually joins me for the Friday show, but this week, our colleague at antiwar.com, Dave DeCamp, is out. Big congratulations to Dave and his wife, Allison, who just had their second boy. That's really awesome for him, and I'm glad that he's taking some time off to spend with his family. But me and Connor are a little extra busy this week, so Connor's now on the show, and the show's coming out a little late today. But I do have a lot to talk about. We have been writing a lot at antiwar.com and the Libertarian Institute, so be sure you're checking out those websites every day to get the show, get what we're writing, and keep up on all the most important foreign policy news. You can share the show from the Institute, from antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee for the video version. Subscribe anywhere you can listen to podcasts. And of course, you can follow me on Twitter at KyleAnzalone_, shows, podcast, if I'm on somebody else's show, any articles I write. I usually tweet out my article with, out the link even, just make it get out there in the algorithm to as many people as possible. So really recommend following me on Twitter. I'm also on Facebook and Instagram, less active there, but almost all my content does get shared on those platforms as well. If you want to add me on Facebook, just do me a favor, and if we don't have any mutual friends, just mention to me that you're a listener of the show or something. Trying to keep the spam bots off my profile this time around, and it's a lot easier when you're dealing with real people. All right, so let's get into the news for today's show. The first article we have here is by Tom Knapp. Knapp is doing a great job. He's usually in the viewpoint section at antiwar.com or on the blog, but he is helping pick up some of the massive void that Dave leaves by taking a couple days off. It takes quite a few of us to cover for him. So Tom Knapp wrote this one for us. Drone manufacturer mates bank on Ukraine war. Tom says, while big-name firms like Lockheed and Raytheon knock down the most money and get the most attention for supporting U.S. military adventurism, new wars buoy smaller companies, especially those which find themselves on the leading edge of the latest battlefield-killing technologies. And this is AeroVironment, and it is a 52-year-old firm that's become the U.S. military's top supplier of small drones, including Switchblade, kamikaze drones that are ordered by the Pentagon to pass on to Ukraine for the war against Russia. On Tuesday, AeroVironment reported a 40% revenue leap for the first quarter of 2023, knocking down $152.3 million versus an analyst prediction of $128.5 million. The company's share price rocketed 20% on Wednesday, putting the stock up 34% year to date. CEO Nawabi says the company currently provides no fewer than 8 drone systems to Ukraine, courtesy of the U.S. taxpayer. According to Open Secrets, AeroVironment has spent about $230,000 so far this year lobbying and employs 8 lobbyists to secure government arms contracts. And so that's obviously how it works is, they're bribing the U.S. government, and this is a part of the reason why the war in Ukraine keeps going on. Next article here by Connor Freeman. This one he wrote for the Libertarian Institute. U.S. carries out test of ICBM amid tensions with North Korea and Russia. The U.S. Air Force and Space Force jointly launched an unarmed Minuteman III intercontinental ballistic missile on Wednesday amidst increasing tensions with Pyongyang and Moscow. The Air Force Global Strike Command carried out the test firing from the Vandenberg Space Force Base in California. Commenting on the test, Colonel Brian Titus said these test launches demonstrate the readiness of U.S. nuclear armed forces and provide confidence in the lethality and effectiveness of the nation's nuclear deterrent. A day earlier, National Security Advisor Jay Sullivan threatened Pyongyang over a potential upcoming meeting between Kim Jong-un, the supreme leader of the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea, and the Russian President Vladimir Putin. Sullivan said this is not going to reflect well on North Korea, and they will pay a price for this in the international community. National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby claimed arms negotiations between the two nations are actively advancing, Although Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov explained that he cannot confirm the leaders' rumored meeting, as there is, from his quote, nothing to say, the U.S. has already pledged $113 billion backing Kiev in its proxy war against Moscow. And so, this is one of the, I think, rather absurd things that the U.S. is doing, where it's providing hundreds of billions to Ukraine, tens of billions of dollars in arms to Ukraine for this war effort, and it's enlisting all of its allies, pressuring every country in the world to do so. But if any country gives, I mean, so much as even a neutral stance towards Russia and decides to maintain the relationship with the Kremlin, we've seen from, then Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan, that the U.S. will, if not outright bat the coup against you, will certainly sign off on it. So this is the situation, and it's created this narrative or this culture in Washington, D.C. that we have to overreact when any country does anything that is, kind in any way towards Moscow. And so, we're seeing this massive reaction over the potential meeting between Kim and Putin. Now, I will say that I know the Kremlin seems to now be downplaying this, but the Russian defense minister did say that he thought it was going to happen. He was recently in North Korea. The latest U.S. military package for Kiev includes depleted uranium ammunition, which is radioactive and toxic, and we'll have a little bit more on that later. The former Defense Intelligence Agency officer Robert Kofer told Fox News Digital that Washington is signaling to Moscow that its nuclear deterrent is combat ready, and should Putin decide to resort to nuclear warfare, whether on the battlefield in Ukraine or outside of it, the risk of unintentional escalation due to misinterpretation of each other's intentions is now heightened. And there is a pretty good article out today. I believe it's actually on the front page of antiwar.com. It's one of the viewpoints by Doug Bondow at at the American Conservative. And what that article explains is the Russian versus American nuclear policy, as when they would use nuclear weapons, and when it would be a potential, when there's potential, even accidental nuclear escalation could occur. So I recommend everybody check that out today if you got a couple minutes. Last Friday, Moscow put its nuclear Sarmat system on combat duty. In 2022, Putin remarked that the advanced ICBM will be to reliably ensure the security of Russia from existential threats and make those who, in their heat of aggressive rhetoric, try to threaten our country think twice. Since 2022, massive joint U.S. and South Korean live-fire war games have resumed, and in response, the DPRK has launched more than 100 missiles. Last week, hours after the U.S. bombers flew in separate joint drills with Tokyo and Seoul, North Korea test-fired 2 short-range tactical ballistic missiles. During the Joe Biden administration's tensions has soared on the Korean Peninsula as Washington's war games, which have seen the White House deploy armed Reaper Jones nuclear-capable bombers and aircraft carriers, as well as nuclear-armed submarines in South Korea, is definitely escalating the situation quite a bit there. Next up, article from Will Porter. Pentagon developing AI drone swarms to deter China. The U.S. military is devising a new system designed to field thousands of drones controlled by artificial intelligence, Deputy Pentagon Chief Kathleen Hitt said on Wednesday, voicing hopes the tech would help to overcome Beijing's advantage in mass. Speaking at the yearly Defense News Conference in Arlington, Virginia, Hitz outlined the Pentagon's new Replicator initiative, which aims to develop a fleet of low-cost AI-powered drones that will operate in swarms in the land, air, and sea. With Replicator, we're beginning an all-domain attributable autonomy, or ADA2, to help us overcome the Pentagon's, or not the Pentagon's, I'm sorry, it's the China's advantage in mass, more ships, more missiles, more forces. And that is interesting because China names its military strategy for the Pacific, A2D2, at where they're trying to deny access to, you know, the region, and so they kind of even use a similar acronym here. That's kind of interesting that the Pentagon came up with it. So Hitz did not specify costs for the new project, but insisted the Pentagon would not draw any additional funds from Congress. Instead, she said replicators would be used existing funding, existing program lines, and existing authorities, although she offered few other details. While Hitz said that conflict with China is neither imminent or inevitable, she went on to stress that the need for deterrence against China, including across the Taiwan Strait in Beijing's backyard. Our goal is to deter because competition does not mean conflict. We must ensure that the PRC wakes up every day, considers the risk of aggression, and concludes today is not that day, and to not just today, but every day now and for the foreseeable future, she said. So, you know, this is really interesting, especially because you know, it's the U.S. military buildup in the region that is causing China to have such a, you know, a stiff reaction. There's a lot of pretending that the U.S. and China are kind of having an equal military buildup against each other, when in reality, the U.S. is building up a lot of forces along China's, in China's backyard, where China is trying to develop the technology to destroy those U.S. forces in China's backyard. Those are quite different things. All right, next up, an article that I wrote for antiwar.com on September 6th. Blinken announces $1 billion more for Ukraine, including depleted uranium. Secretary of State Antony Blinken announced Wednesday that the U.S. would send over $1 billion in additional aid to Ukraine. The funds include $275 million for the military, $300 million for the police, and over $200 million in humanitarian assistance. I know that doesn't actually top $1 billion, but I couldn't figure out exactly where the rest of the money was going. Blinken threw around quite a few numbers in his speech, and I think there's probably another $100 million in like direct financial assistance is the best way I could figure it out. But there is some missing money there from the numbers that Blinken just kind of went over in his speech. The arms package includes depleted uranium known to cause grave health and environmental consequences. The top American diplomat explained that $175 million worth of weapons will be transferred from the U.S. to Ukraine under the Presidential Drawdown Authority. Blinken made the announcement while meeting with top Ukrainian officials and attending photo ops in Kiev. According to the Department of Defense, the package includes equipment to support air defense system, ammunition for HIMARS, 155mm and 105mm artillery rounds. The Pentagon is also providing 81mm mortar systems and rounds, 120mm depleted uranium tank ammunition, tow missiles, Javelin and AT-4 anti-armor systems, small arm ammunition, tactical air navigation systems, tactical secure communication systems, and support equipment, as well as demolition munitions. The package is the 46th the White House has approved during Joe Biden's administration. It is the first time that Washington has approved the transfer of depleted uranium to Ukraine. The ammunition is toxic and has lead to cancer and birth defects in places that it has been used, including in Iraq, where the U.S. used it against the Iraqis. The Pentagon said the total military aid to Ukraine now tops $43 billion. Blinken said Kiev will additionally receive $100 million in grants to buy weapons in the future. Blinken remarked that the aid announcement was a requirement to make the trip to Ukraine. He said, never go to someone's home without bringing a housewarming gift. And it's kind of interesting that housewarming gift will be $1 billion of somebody else's money, but that's the comment he made. We come bearing some future assistance for Ukraine across multiple areas, but that assistance does not actually mean anything unless it's used effectively. While in Kiev, the diplomat engaged in photo ops, including holding a puppy in a children's hospital. What a despicable person. During a press conference with his Ukrainian counterpart, Blinken said he visited a war cemetery earlier in the day and remarked how He had an emotional response to seeing the faces of so many dead young Ukrainians. While Blinken blasted Russian President Vladimir Putin as solely to blame for their deaths, Washington has pushed Kiev into an unwinnable military situation. Before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the White House declined to negotiate an agreement with the Kremlin that could have averted the war. Just after the invasion, Washington squashed talks between Kiev and Moscow. In recent months, the U.S. pushed Ukraine to engage into launching an offensive that the Pentagon knew would cause high casualties. For Kiev, Washington coerced Kiev into deploying tactics that would cause such high losses, despite the U.S. intelligence community assessing that the offensive had little chance of success. And so Blinken is far more responsible for a lot of the people in that graveyard than just about anybody else. All right. Next up here, U.S. pledges millions seized from Russian oligarchs in latest Ukraine aid package. And so I just kind of went over Blinken's speech, but Connor also has an article on it because there's something else in there that's really important. And Connor says Secretary of State Antony Blinken announced another pledge of funds to Ukraine worth $1 billion in military and other financial aid, including in that sum is $5.4 million in assets seized belonging to Russian oligarchs and will go towards veteran services. Blinken declared those who have enabled Putin's war of aggression should pay for it. This is the first time sanctioned Russian oligarchs' assets will be included in an assistance package for the Ukrainian government. Washington's top diplomat discussed how deeply moved he was visiting a military cemetery with his Ukrainian counterpart. Although on the eve of Kiev's failed counteroffensive, which has yielded massive losses, Blinken actively discouraged peace talks, which Beijing attempted to broker, ruling out any potential for a ceasefire. So, kind of makes the same point I made there. But I think this is a significant escalation that the U.S. is doing this. And I'm not sure what kind of retaliation we're going to see from Moscow, but I wouldn't be surprised if there is some kind of retaliation. All right, this is, I think, a pretty huge story. U.S. intel official, media misleading Americans about Ukraine's battlefield successes. In an interview with renowned reporter Seymour Hersh, a U.S. intelligence official scolded the media for misleading the American public about Ukraine's battlefield failures during the spring counteroffensive. The unnamed official additionally told Hersh he believes that Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered the assassination of PMC Wagner chief Prigozhin to de-escalate tensions with Moscow. Responding to reports in recent weeks that Ukrainian forces were gaining momentum and recapturing territory, the official remarked, "Where are reporters getting this stuff?" he asked. "There are stories talking about drunk Russian commanders while Ukrainians are penetrating 3 lines of Russian defenses and will be able to work back to Mariupol." He continued, "The goal of Russia's first line of defenses was not to stop the Ukrainian counteroffensive, but to slow it down so there was a Ukrainian advance, Russian commanders could bring in reserves to fortify the line. There is no evidence that Ukrainian forces have gotten past the first line. The American press is doing anything but honest reporting on the failures of the war in this offensive." Secretary of State Antony Blinken delivered a similarly optimistic message during his trip to Kiev on Wednesday. He said, "In the ongoing counteroffensive, progress has accelerated in the past few weeks. The new assistance will help sustain it and build further momentum." The official says that the message is being delivered from military intelligence to the White House, while the CIA has drawn other conclusions. This kind of reporting from the military intelligence community is going to the White House, but there are other views, he said, referring to the CIA. The official explained that those views do not reach President Joe Biden. For over 3 months, Kiev has ordered its forces to advance on entrenched Russian defensive lines in southern Ukraine. Russian minefields caused Ukraine to take significant losses to its Western-trained soldiers and equipment in the early weeks of the counteroffensive. The massive push by Ukraine resulted in nearly no territorial gains. Still, Washington has pushed Kiev to continue its counteroffensive. The White House acknowledges that for Ukraine to have any possibility of success, Ukraine will have to be willing to sustain high casualties. The official Also told Hirsch that no matter how committed Kiev is to the war effort, President Zelensky's goals are unattainable. He said Zelensky will never get his land back. The official also spoke about the assassination of Prigozhin last month. He believes that Putin ordered the killing because the mercenary boss had begun to provoke NATO members. He said, by early August, there were reports of border tensions as the remnants of the Wagner Group made the service of intrusions into the airspace of Poland and troublesome threats at the border of Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and Finland, Hirsch writes. For Putin, triggering complaints from NATO countries was an unforgivable breach. The U.S. intelligence official told Hirsch that was it. So interesting, that this is portrayed in the West as some terrible thing that Putin did. And you had this U.S. intelligence official saying that, no, it was, really aimed at de-escalating tensions between Russia and the West. All right, next up here, Connor Freeman writes on Ukraine's growing assassination program. Connor writes, Ukraine's Domestic Security Service, the SBU, has an elite ancillary known as the 5th Counterintelligence Directorate, which has taken a central role in the counter-Russia operations, specializing in wet work or assassinations, according to The Economist. The report discusses the killings of the former mayor of a town in the Kharkiv region after he had been targeted as a collaborator with Moscow. The man was mercilessly stalked for days by a group of local officers from the SSO before being murdered with a bomb. And the report says over 18 months of war, people like this mayor have been targeted in cynical operations across occupied Ukraine and inside Russia itself. They have been shot, blown up, hanged, and even on occasion poisoned with Dr. Brandy. The SSO is described as a relatively new group that directs the resistance movement, Ukraine's partisans. One officer in the SSO told the outlet that the group is demanding more authority to get operations inside of Russia. And of course, this would be provocative, but I think also just goes to show that Ukraine isn't some great enlightened democracy like we pretend that it is, but, rather is a cruel government, just like most of the ones that exist in the world. All right. Next up, I wrote this for antiwar.com. Zelensky speaks with Netanyahu, requests more support from Israel. Ukrainian President Zelensky spoke with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu by phone on Thursday. The leaders discussed how Tel Aviv could support Kiev's fight against Russia and the potential deployment of Israeli police to Ukraine to support Jewish pilgrims. According to a press release from Zelensky's office, the Ukrainian leader requested more assistance from Netanyahu. The press release said the president emphasized the importance of Israel's support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. The parties discussed possible ways for Israel to support Ukraine's encountering Russia's invasion. Netanyahu's office said Zelensky requested air defenses, and this is the statement from Israel. The two leaders discussed continuation of Israel's assistance to Ukraine, including the advancement and development of assistance of civilian air defense systems. I don't think there's any difference between a civilian air defense system and a regular air defense system. So this, I think, would mean Israeli weapons transfers to Ukraine. The leaders also discussed the possibility of Tel Aviv sending Israeli police to Ukraine to support Jews making pilgrimages to Uman, a city in central Ukraine. The Israeli side estimates that 50,000 Hasidic pilgrims may arrive in Uman this year. It is emphasized that at present, the bomb shelters at the pilgrimage sites in Uman can only accommodate about 11,000 people. The Ukrainian press release added the possibility of sending additional Israeli police forces to the pilgrimage sites was also discussed. Early in the war, Tel Aviv emerged as a potential broker to end the war between Russia and Ukraine. Then Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett reported that Tel Aviv made significant success in reaching an agreement, including securing concessions from Russian President Vladimir Putin. Bennett says the talks were ultimately squashed by Washington. Since those negotiations fell through, the White House and Kiev pressed Israel to break its long-standing ties with Moscow and provide Ukraine with military support. Israel has provided Ukraine with non-military aid only. So, I do feel like there's this real effort in Washington to make sure there are essentially no neutral countries left in this fight, to make sure that it could really never be brought to an end. All right, next up, I wrote this one for antiwar.com. Western sanctions on Russia fracture G20 ahead of upcoming summit. The Washington-led effort to remove Russia from the world economy is widening divisions within the Group of 20, according to the AP. Now, just real quick, the G20 is quite a bit different than the G7. The G7 was the Group of 8, and it included Russia before the other 7 members kicked Russia out. Over, I believe, the annexation of Crimea was the kind of real thing they cited when they removed Russia from that. And so the G7 is a solid coalition of U.S. allies. That is not the case of the G20. This is more a major world economic forum. So the outlet reports that Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen is facing growing skepticism from some leading rich and developing nations as the residual impact of sanctions against Russia is deepening divisions among the Group of 20 countries. With world leaders and finance ministers meeting this week in India for the G20 summit, fractures have come into the open and alliances are tightening among some nations that have long been resistant to U.S.-led efforts to extract economic punishment on Moscow for its war in Ukraine. And again, that is from the AP. Since 2014, Washington has issued sanctions against Moscow over various grievances. In some cases, such as the Sergei Skripal poisoning, the 2016 election interference, and the assassination attempt on Alexei Navalny, the West has failed to produce compelling evidence for the sanctions. After the invasion of Ukraine last year, U.S. President Joe Biden announced that the U.S. would cripple the Russian economy with sanctions. Washington and its European partners have issued several rounds of sanctions on Russian individuals, businesses, and industries without significantly impacting Moscow's economy. The Kremlin has weathered the economic war by finding partners outside of the White House's orbit. Russia is increasing oil sales to India and China. Additionally, economic forums such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and BRICS Plus have added new members, giving Moscow new opportunities to engage in trade outside control of the U.S. Treasury Department. After failures in Iraq and Afghanistan, sanctions became a favorite tool of U.S. policymakers in Washington to exact revenge on countries that do not comply with the White House's dictates. Now, dozens of countries are still facing sanctions that are often enforced over questionable allegations. Sanctions on Cuba, Venezuela, North Korea, Zimbabwe, Syria, and Afghanistan have all significantly impacted the development of those nations and increased suffering among the people. Economic penalties continue to be imposed on countries, even as nearly all sanctions campaigns have failed to alter the behavior of the targeted government. The South African president argued that moving away from the U.S.-based world economy will add stability. He said, "We are concerned about global financial and payment systems are increasingly being used as instruments of geopolitical consternation. Global economy recovery relies on predictable global payment systems and smooth operating of banking supply chains, trade, tourism, and financial flows." China's President Xi said the White House can use the dollar-based system to crush developing nations. The U.S. is obsessed with maintaining its hegemony and has gone out of its way to cripple the emerging markets and developing countries. Whoever is developing fast becomes a target of containment. Whoever is catching up becomes a target of obstructions. South Africa and Chinese leaders made the statements at a recent BRICS summit where the bloc added 6 new members. The expansion of BRICS is viewed as a potential alternative to the global economy dominated by the U.S. Brazil, India, China, Russia, South Africa, Argentina are members of BRICS and the G20. All right, let's move on here and talk about Poland. Poland aims to create largest army in Europe within 2 years. Poland's deputy prime minister told a group of arms manufacturers that Warsaw will have Europe's strongest land force within 2 years through a series of weapons purchases. Warsaw believes that increasing military spending to 3% GDP and expanding its military to 300,000 personnel will make this Polish army so powerful it cannot be challenged. The deputy prime minister issued a letter to the International Defense Industry Exposition being held in Poland this week. It said, in 2 years, we will be the strongest land army in Europe. The Polish defense minister emphasized that the strength of the army is not just and not primarily its size, but also equipment and innovation. Warsaw announced plans to significantly increase weapons spending last year. Next year, Polish military expenditures are expected to hit at least 3% of GDP. Some Polish officials hope that number could be pushed to as high as 5% in coming years. Poland will spend the added funds on a sequence of massive military acquisitions, including multi-billion-dollar purchases of Apache helicopters, Abrams tanks, and HIMARS. Additionally, Warsaw plans to expand its military to 300,000 soldiers. Polish officials claim massive military buildup is an effort to prevent war. This is from the Polish Prime Minister. The Polish army must be so powerful it does not have to fight due to its strength alone. We want peace, and if we want that, we must prepare for war. In connection with that, we are strengthening the Polish army. However, some experts believe the policy will weaken Poland economically. Polish military expert and Krasuda and resident fellow at the Kazimierz Polaski Foundation, I'm sure I butchered all those Polish words right there, said it seems highly likely that such a large scale of planned orders is largely driven by political populism aimed at gaining popularity here and now, rather than to be a real comprehensive and well thought out plan for harmoniously strengthening the armed forces. Poland should ensure that these procurement programs are sustainable and affordable in the long term. The country should avoid the risk of overspending, which now seems very high. And so, again, we have Polish experts warning that this policy might not plan out as Warsaw hopes. All right. I believe this is the last story I got from Connor Freeman today. ICC lead prosecutor, we will prosecute cyber war crimes. So this, I believe, is important, and it's something that kind of got lost last month. It didn't get a lot of reporting on, and, Connor dug this up, and so I'm really glad he wrote this up. He said, in an article published last month in Foreign Policy Analytics, Carmen Khan, the lead prosecutor at the ICC, the International Criminal Court, based in The Hague, declared that his office will now be investigating and potentially prosecuting war crimes committed in cyberspace. This comes as the Joe Biden administration began to share evidence of alleged Russian war crimes committed in Ukraine with the ICC. And so it's not really specific to Russia that the ICC, they didn't say that we're doing this to target Russia, but it's pretty clear that they are doing this to target Russia. And so my guess is that maybe the next round of war crimes that we see from the ICC targeting Russia have to do with cyberspace. And maybe that's because they haven't been able to come up with it as much as they had hoped. All right, a little bit of good news here. Iran slows nuclear enrichment, opening window for Biden to make a deal. I wrote this for antiwar.com on September 7th. The UN Nuclear Arms Monitoring Organization confirmed that Iran is decreasing its rate of production of 60% enriched uranium and diluting its existing stockpile. Tehran's decision could open the door for diplomacy on the nuclear issue. Reuters reported it viewed a document produced by the IAEA, that's the International Atomic Energy Agency, outlining Tehran's move to limit its nuclear enrichment program. After then, President Donald Trump exited the nuclear agreement with Iran in 2018. Tehran responded to American sanctions by increasing its enrichment program, which had been restricted by the 2015 deal that Trump broke. However, Iran has never attempted to enrich uranium to the 90% level needed for our bomb, and there is no indication, and this is, an assessment of the U.S. intelligence community that Tehran is seeking to develop nuclear weapons. Henry Rome of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy explained that the reduction in 60% enriched uranium production opened a door for the White House to engage in diplomacy. The slowdown sets the stage for additional diplomacy this fall around the nuclear issue. For Washington, there is probably a low bar for what Iran needed to do for the purposes of de-escalation. Iran has likely crossed that bar. He added that the Joe Biden administration would avoid inking a deal with Tehran until after the 2024 election, albeit with the goal of reaching a new deal until after the presidential election. And so this is kind of interesting that he's even saying that basically from now until November 2024, the goal of the White House isn't really to make a deal with Iran, to get Iran back into the nuclear deal. The goal is just to make sure tensions don't get any higher with Iran. And so there are a couple other issues going on here. Biden faces stiff resistance in Congress and elsewhere when he makes any effort to talk with Iran. Israel attacked Iranian ships in 2021 as Washington was preparing to engage in direct talks with Iran. In August of this year, a group of Republican representatives slammed the White House for pursuing a nuclear understanding with Iran alongside a hostage deal. Even within Biden's own party, prominent Democrats such as Senator Bob Menendez blasted the administration for engaging in talks with Iran to revive the Obama-era nuclear agreement. And so, Biden, I think, could return to this deal. I don't want to, just give him the out in the past there. However, it would involve serious political capital and sending his foreign policy officials out to every day explain to the American people the U.S. intelligence community doesn't believe Iran is building a bomb. Iran has never tried to build a bomb. Iran doesn't pose a threat to the U.S. The U.S. has nothing to worry about from Iran, but that doesn't seem likely to happen anytime soon since Iran is the enemy of Tel Aviv and Joe Biden is, Israel's greatest advocate in Washington. All right, everybody, that'll do it for the show today. Thank you so much for tuning in. I will have more on the Syria situation next week. I have been covering that for the Institute, so if you head on over to the Institute, you can read my articles about U.S. forces squaring off there. But I do want to figure out what's going on over the weekend here, because one of the sides in that conflict is saying that they're trying to end it. I don't know if that is particularly genuine, but I think there could be a lot of updates over the weekend. So I'll plan to talk about that on Monday's show. And anyways, everybody, thank you so much for tuning in. Back with more next week.